Talks speaker series. This is our first one. It's brought to you by the GVSU Advertising Public Relations Biometrics Lab in the School of Communications. My name is Robin Spring. I'm an associate professor of advertising and public relations and also part of the AdPR Biometrics Lab crew. Dr. Imran Mazid is here. He's our associate professor of advertising and public relations and the biometrics lab coordinator. And then Georgia Hessel is our esteemed grad assistant for the AdPR Biometrics Lab. So she's going to be running a lot of the tech, and I'm going to do the moderation and introductions and all of that. But we're so glad that you're here. We're so happy to start this series. There's so much to talk about in technology and how it affects advertising and public relations. So, our first speaker, and we want to thank you so much, Ewa, for joining us, is Dr. Ewa Maslowska. She has a PhD and is associate professor in the Charles H. Sandage Department of Advertising at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The title of this talk is called Studying Attention to Media Content Across Devices, Implications for Advertising. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Ewa. Um, she is also an affiliate in the Institute of Communication Research, Informatics, and Center for Social and Behavioral Science. Ewa studies people and brands on digital platforms. She uses experiments to trace data to investigate the effects of algorithmic personalization and e-word of mouth on consumers' attention, perceptions, and decision making. Her current projects are investigating dark patterns and fake online reviews. Timely. Ewa received her PhD in communications from the University of Amsterdam in her MA in psychology in her home university in Poland. So I'm gonna turn it right over to Ewa so she has plenty of time to talk about biometrics and tell us about her research. And I would like to invite all our participants to, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or there's also a Q&A section. If you look at the more with the three dots at the bottom of your Zoom, you can put your questions in either place, and then we'll field those questions after Ewa gives her talk. So go ahead and take it away for us, Ewa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a nice introduction. Let me share my screen so that it's official. It has started. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. It's so great to see so many of you and to see many of you actually, which I really appreciate. I know that yesterday was an exciting day, so I was afraid that many people would not show up today. So I'm very happy to see many of you here. I also wanted to say that I will try to look into the chat, but multitasking is difficult, right? And almost impossible, I would argue. So also if there is a question that you really want to ask, what you want me to clarify something or discuss something further, just please, you can raise your hand or just interrupt me, and I'm happy to answer so that we can also make it a little bit more interactive. And, I can talk forever, especially about these topics. I can be very talkative. So it's even better if you interrupt me from time to time so we can have a discussion. Okay, so now you know who I am. Was that a...
Oh, I was just going to say, we'll watch the chat. You don't have to worry about that, and we'll go ahead and ask the questions for you.
Perfect. Thank you. So now, let me see. So you know who I am, so I can skip the introduction so we can go directly into biometrics methods. So I want to talk about attention and eye tracking mostly today, but because I'm the first one in the series, I wanted to also place it in the broader context of biometric methods and psychophysiology. And especially when we focus on communication and media and advertising research, we usually discuss the following, the biometrics that you can see now on the screen. So eye tracking is a very popular method to track eye movements and gaze patterns. More on that soon. And we usually use it to study visual attention to different types of stimuli. Quite often it's ads or packaging, websites. So what Robin mentioned, like my current projects are actually looking into some dark patterns on websites, and eye tracking is a good method to really track what people pay attention to. Then galvanic skin response or electrodermal activity is a measure of changes in skin conductance. So the idea is that as we get more excited, we sweat more. And by that, of course, I don't mean that we really like that is visible. These changes are actually minimal, so that you may not even, or we may not realize that we're sweating a little bit more at this time. And now, as we sweat more, the electrical conductance improves, right? So that electrical signal travels faster. So this is a method that we often use to actually gauge emotional responses, and that may be to marketing stimuli. Then heart rate. This method is growing in popularity, mostly because many of us have some kind of a smart device, right? And these devices track our heart rate. Some of them track our temperature as well. Temperature can be used, but it's less popular. Again, here the idea is that our attention and emotional arousal displays as like an increased heart rate or more variability in our heart rate. We also have EMG, and this is an unpleasant exercise for participants often when we actually place electrodes, usually on the face, but of course EMG is used also in like in the medical field where it's placed in other places as well. But we mostly focus on facial muscles to track how people respond to stimuli. And again, do they smile? Do they frown? So what's the emotional response? Then we also have facial expression analysis, and that's quite a new development, which is driven by developments in algorithms and AI, where we actually, something that we used to do manually, the AI can do that for us. And that I will again talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. And of course, we also have EEGs, which tell us a little bit more about cognitive processing. I have to say that this method is very often used in psychology and a little bit in marketing research. But as you can imagine, it's time-consuming and difficult and very noisy. So it's good to study simple stimuli. But if you have much more complex stimuli, it becomes very difficult. And finally, fMRI, which this is something I do not do. It's just way beyond my expertise. But it's an interesting method to see brain activity. And so you put people in fMRI and then you see where the blood actually goes to, right? Which regions of the brain. And then we try to correlate that with the responses to the stimulus. And here are just some examples of what we can do. So we can use these different methods, often in combination. So for example, we can, like the first study used EEG, eye tracking, GSR to predict the effectiveness of TV commercials and correlate that with sales data. There are other studies, or another example where they actually combined EEG, eye tracking, and self-reports to measure responses to like anti-smoking public service announcements, right? Or smoking cessation campaigns. There is that famous study, I would say, of Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, where they placed participants in an fMRI and wanted to understand responses to brands and then effects of those brands on what people actually taste, right? How they evaluate the taste of products. Here's another, there's no sound, so like it should be fine. Oh, there is sound, sorry. It's just music. So this is another study, just an example from a company that looked at how people react to Nespresso's ad. this is not new. This is from like 2016. As you can see, the interface is a little bit old-fashioned. But what they did, again, they put together EEG, GSR, and eye tracking to understand how people attend to and emotionally respond to that commercial. And they noticed that actually in this case, the commercial was pretty successful, but then when they looked at different groups, there were differences. So, for example, in this case, it was that women were much more positive towards the commercial. Then in this case, there were two groups, women and men, and women were more positive. Quite often you will hear things like subconscious responses, right? Or maybe non-conscious. So I would probably not use that language when talking about these methods. I would probably focus more on like kind of involuntary biological responses, because some of these things we do know at conscious level, right? If I'm watching a horror movie and I'm afraid, I know that I'm afraid, right? It's not subconscious. However, sometimes these reactions may be, we may have less of those metacognitions about these reactions, or maybe they're more subtle. And the idea behind biometrics is that we can actually look into those kind of involuntary, or maybe sometimes reactions that we don't realize, and we cannot manipulate them. So the thing is, if you ask me in a self-report survey how I feel about an espresso commercial, I can say the different things, right? I can say that I love it because I'm expecting that that's what you want to hear, maybe. I may say that I don't really know, to be honest, right? But we cannot, it's very difficult. Maybe some people can who train very hard, right? But we cannot trick our heart rate, or it's very difficult to trick our body into not sweating more when we get excited, for example. And this type of research is not new, right? Like, I think eye trackers were used in like the 60s. And you can see that if you look at the literature, you can find like lots of studies being conducted using these different biometric methods. But I have a feeling now that they're increasing in popularity and importance. And we see that in marketing, in like actual industry research, that companies are using, for example, eye tracking or facial analysis, a little bit of like fMRI as well. If you think about like I think the most famous industry application of eye tracking would be banner blindness. How they, like, I think it was Nielsen, but don't quote me on that. How it was identified that people on purpose avoid banner advertisements on websites, right? And they could really see that people try not to see, right? So that people consciously want to force their eyes not to look at ads. And I don't know if you follow the developments in especially the advertising literature, the recent developments, we see an increase in research using these methods as well. There was a recent initiative just from 2 months ago, I think, of the Journal of Advertising Research with MediaProbe. MediaProbe is a company that uses biometrics to study people's responses to media content, mostly on TV. And they collaborated to release data and hopefully, produce more research in this domain. And you're not too late. There is a special issue of the Journal of Advertising on biometrics in advertising research, and that's due end of this month. So there's still time to submit to that one. But it shows that there is a lot going on in that area, and that there's lots of interest as well. Why is that? Like, one of my hypotheses is that it's becoming easier to conduct this type of research. So this is an eye tracker from I think like it was published in 1967. And I can tell you that when I was a student, just a few years ago, maybe like like 20 years ago, the eye tracker looked better, but it was still very complex, right? And very unpleasant. The same with EEG. Like I participated also as a student in EEG studies, and they were like not fun to participate in, right? It was good that we were actually like paid or reimbursed with credits for participating. Now, if you look at modern eye trackers, I will show you some. They look nothing like this turbo thing that looks like a torture machine, right? Here, this is an example of media probes tool to measure that galvanic skin response. So this is what the panel participants do. They just watch TV and wear this thing, and that sensor keeps measuring the responses, and then they answer some surveys, right? It's not invasive at all anymore. Another thing is that the analysis of the data became so much easier because we have software that that can really aggregate the data for us, make it so much easier for us to analyze. Because if you look at EEG data or eye tracking data or even GSR data, you have many points per minute, data points, and it just becomes very big data and very messy. But now we have software that will do lots of the cleaning for us, making it possible for researchers who may not necessarily be very well trained or like even interested in dealing with these gigantic data sets to be able to use these methods. One thing that all these methods have in common is the assumption and the belief that cognitive processes can be inferred from bodily reactions, right? So that how our bodies react to, in our case, in what we study in the communication, media content, tells us a lot about what people think and how they feel. And if you're looking for like your starting point in this adventure, this book on psychophysiological measurement and meaning actually is very useful because it does talk about like a number of these assumptions that we have and which create context or background for psychographic or like psychophysiological or biometric research. So now a little bit about like more specific studies, right? So I promised you eye tracking and a little bit of facial expressions analysis. And I also have to warn you that there's going to be both the pros and the cons. So there's going to be the beauty of the methods, but I am going to give you some warning messages, or maybe, something just to keep in mind as you engage with this type of research. So eye tracking is a good method to measure attention, as I mentioned. And, if you look at these two pictures, they look very differently from that old eye tracking machine. So today we have tiny glasses, right? And Google, I think, had their own Google glasses, which also enabled kind of eye tracking. If you look at Apple glasses, those have also cameras. They cannot do eye tracking, but they could. There would be that opportunity, technologically that it's possible. So they're tiny, they're light, not invasive. This is what you see here is an eye tracker that's mounted to a screen, computer screen. You will have lots of different measures, like a lot. So some basic measures would be just fixations and gaze points, right? So this is where your eyes look at. And then if these fixations happen close to each other, they will form these kind of clusters, and that will tell us that, oh, this is the area that the person really focuses on, and probably processing that information more carefully. You can also have time spent or dwell time within that space. So this is like all the time spent there. Heat maps, you see heat maps probably quite often because they really like a good, more qualitative, I would say, method to compare people's attention to different stimuli. And again, they will tell us more about like the attention intensity at these specific points of the stimulus. Areas of interest is what we use a lot, meaning we have to create the areas on which we want to focus on. So these are the areas where we really want to track attention. And sometimes we're only interested in the ad, for example, right? We're not interested in the whole website, or we may be interested in one social media post. So we would kind of draw an area of interest around it. And you can also look at like revisits. So do people come back to that stimulus or that area? What does that tell us, right? Is it because it's especially interesting? Is it because it's difficult to understand? Sometimes you have to look at several different measures to actually figure that out. You can also look at like in which order that happens. So do they first go, and I'll show you another example of that in a second, but do they first go to a certain area, and do they have to consult a different area of your stimulus to understand the first area? That may be the suggestion why they like jump between the two. There are also other measures that are often used and very useful, like time to first fixation, right? Which will tell you how quickly people identify certain region on your stimulus and fixate on it. And that may be a measure of like something is easy to discover. It may also be that it's just very attention grabbing. So probably if you have a stimulus with, I don't know, like a bright color, that may grab the attention, right? First fixation duration, which may indicate engagement, but also difficulty in extracting information. The number of fixations. There are also saccades, which would be, whatever happened, like the jump of eyes between two fixations. This is more useful, especially if you look at like reading studies, right? Or if you want to have a specific understanding of how people process a stimulus, you may look at saccades as well. Some studies also look at how your pupils dilate, right? So do they become bigger? That may be an indication of emotional arousal or cognitive processing, but it's difficult because it's influenced by light in the room, personal characteristics. Some people just have like more dilated pupils. So there are many things to kind of take into account. These eye tracking measures are often used with mouse tracking. So when you are, especially when you're studying websites or something that's scrollable or something that's interactive, you can also track the mouse of the participant. And the idea here is that it's correlated to what people look at and what's important to them. But of course, now that we're also used to not using the mouse, but the like your phone or maybe the pad on your computer, this is more difficult to measure or to track. And again, I can make some recommendations for like, this eye tracking book is like 500 pages with many different measures listed there. I personally love it because it's very well explained. But before each study, you will be like, okay, which measures are actually relevant to my particular study, right? Because there are so many of them, and we have the software, we can measure everything, but we don't need to report everything, and we don't need to focus on everything. It really depends on your research questions. So now let me give you some examples from my own research. One will be from e-commerce, one will be about advertising, and another will be about kind of learning information, including political information from social media. Why do we study attention to this type of information? So first of all, we know that's an important driver of information processing. So many studies have shown that what people look at is what people are interested in, what they want to process, what they learn from. Of course, there are exceptions with like blind staring, right? If I start daydreaming and I stare at some point, that may happen, right? Of course, in real life. But usually not in the lab when you have a goal. We also know that attention is an important factor in preference formation and decision making. So we often see that the stimulus that attracts attention and gets and engages attention is later on more selected more. It also helps us with learning and improves recall of information. When it comes to the results regarding attention effects on evaluation of an object, and like especially in advertising on ad evaluation and brand attitudes, the results are a little bit more mixed because some studies say, oh, there's mere exposure effects, right? So I look at it for longer and more times maybe, so I should be liking it more. But there are also studies that say, oh, but it actually may trigger counter-arguing, right? Again, we only know attention. We know that people look, but if we don't measure other things, we don't know what they think, right? So they may actually be counter-arguing at the same time, and that's why they're paying more attention. That's why triangulation of methods is so important. And we often do that. So we'll use surveys together with social media metrics and with mouse tracking. But we know that eye tracking helps us capture responses to many different types of stimuli. When we started this line of research, most of the participants in the previous studies were exposed to like a very static stimulus. And we know that that's not what's out there anymore. Like digital media is very interactive, and like we scroll, we visit many pages at one, like in one session, etc. There was one study, and now maybe there's a few more that actually used, for example, participants' own social media news feeds that allow them to have this more interactive and scrollable experience. And another thing is the device, right? So I showed you the screen with the eye tracker, I showed you the glasses, but what should we do with mobile devices? And when we look at people's consumption of information, a lot of it happens on mobile, right? And that mobile information consumption is very different than when you consume information on a laptop or desktop computer, right? Or something that's a printout. It's what they call more of like information snacking, so that we consume in short periods of time and very like shorter chunks of information or smaller chunks of information. So our goals for these studies were to capture attention to these diverse types of contents, which are dynamic across different devices. And we also looked at whether it's in public or in private, because of that mobile exposure that often happens in public. So think on a bus, on a metro, right? Or actually, here on campus, people walk around and they just read something on their phones, right? So this is the first study, and this is my first eye tracking adventure as a researcher and not as a student. So this is the eye tracker I showed you before. This is the headstand, so or headrest. So this is where we ask participants to place their heads, not very comfortable because this is wooden. So think of like if you ever go to an eye doctor, like you have this pretty comfortable headrest for the machines. This is supposed to play a similar role. You don't always need it. You only need it if you have stimuli that like require participants to really pay attention to like small areas of interest, right? Or if people start moving a lot, so it's really important that they don't move. And these were our websites. So we were interested in people's decision making and what they take into account. Like, is it the description of the product? Is it the reviews that others have written? Is it the these cues? Who wrote the review? What about the price? And things like that. in the next studies, in like following studies, we actually used the dynamic social media feed. So we had something that simulated Facebook. I know that Facebook is like, especially now, not very popular anymore. Back then, it was actually still quite popular. And we had like a variety of posts, including posts about politics and what was happening in town, what was happening at the university. So some of them were news, some of them were like more entertainment. And we also had an ad. And I don't know if you know Taste of Nature. It didn't exist. It exists. It's a real brand, but for our participants, it was an unknown brand, which was like, it had pros and cons for that study, but it allowed us to use like something that's like an actual thing, but is unknown to our participants, and we manipulated also if that satisfied customers this label. So here we had participants also being exposed to this social media feed, let's call it a Facebook simulated feed, on a laptop versus a mobile. So you can see it's not entirely natural, because usually we scroll, like we hold the phone differently. But it allowed us to track what this particular was looking at when scrolling through information here. And this is the eye tracker. And on desktop, it was, so I don't see my, here you can see how people were, this is your heat map, right? And you can see what they are looking at and for how long. And this is average. So, this average, yes. And you can also, like, this is done with emotions. So, but other types of software would give you similar measures. So it will give you the pupil dilation, distance from the computer, and so I have to follow up whether there's like any, whether they there's like whether they drift away from the what they were supposed from the what from the focus of their attention. And we did this study also like in lab and then also in a public place. So that was that, on the go kind of public environment. And we wanted to see if this private, quiet, kind of private, because it's a lab, right? So it's not entirely public, private, but it's quiet versus this environment where there are many people walking around and disturbing. Okay, I've been talking for way too long already, probably. I will tell you very quickly what we measured. So different eye tracking measures. We focus mostly on dwell time. So this is where people spend their time. So this is like within an area of interest, all the fixations and saccades together, right? So this is where they pay their attention. Then attitudes, intentions, choice, learning outcomes, and some possible correlates, like something that we could, if we needed to control for, like how much social media they use and how much time they spend on their phones. And I can just tell you, we didn't find differences in attention to that advertising message between devices. That attention to advertising message had positive effects on attitudes and intentions. We also had a choice task that didn't really work great, but I think there may be many other reasons for that, because we asked them to, like, we gave them lots of different bars and granola bars, like they didn't know this one, so maybe they didn't want to do that. Overall, we didn't really find differences between devices in attention, but we did find that people focus more on the picture when they use a desktop computer, and just the headings of the posts on social media when they use a mobile. The learning outcomes did differ across desktop and mobile. So this is the lesson learned. Actually, do focus on your desk. Like, it's better to learn from the desktop. It wasn't, or like from your laptop, from a bigger screen. It wasn't mediated by attention, though. And we also found out that people spend more time scrolling when they were in public, but actually they learned more from the exposure when they were in a private environment. So again, that only shows, especially for students, if you really want to learn for the exam or study for the exam and learn a lot, bigger screen, stop the distractions, right? Quiet room, don't multitask. What else have we learned? So I will just tell you that before you mute me. These studies are fun, right? They're lots of fun. You have a lab, great. I would say read about it and start doing things. But also they require lots of decisions. So my recommendations, talk to, other students, your professors, your colleagues, friends, and really talk about your studies several times, because it's easy to make mistakes with eye tracking studies, in that you have to decide what kind of eye tracker you want to use. Is it glasses or that bar? Sampling rate, quite often we go for what we have, but it's also a decision, right? Like if you think about it, 60 hertz, for example, that's like 60 measurements per minute. If you do an ad study, that's probably enough, right? But if you're doing a reading study, you probably need a higher sampling rate, because you need more of these measurements more often. It's very difficult to develop stimulus to control for all the visual elements that may affect attention. I made my mistakes even in the studies that I showed you, and I learned from them. Things like colors, size, like it's difficult to control for everything. The complexity, right, of the visual stimulus. Lab setup, like the light, distractions, right? Do you need that headrest? It's not comfortable. I would probably you don't. Calibration, when do you decide that it's good enough? Different measures, as I told you, there's so many. And sometimes we have to create our own, right? Like maybe you need to account for the size of the stimulus and you need to control for that somehow. So you need to create your own, maybe a proportion measure or something. And don't be surprised when you get your data that it looks like this, that it's very skewed, because eye tracking data is often skewed. And then you also have to figure out, what do I do with it? How do I really analyze it? Okay, I do have more. I wanted to tell you a little bit more, but it's okay. I can finish here.
You know what, Eva, we don't have any questions at the moment, so I'm fine with you continuing. But I want to remind the people that are listening to go ahead and ask questions, and we'll make sure that we let Eva know what you're wondering about.
I tend to count 1 minute per slide, but often it's it's a biased measure. So let me very quickly, if you're still awake and with me, we can very quickly talk about some other studies that I'm working on and thinking about, and maybe some of that's going to be inspiring or not, or maybe you have some comments to me and can help me. So one study that we're developing with my master student actually will look at attention to podcasts, to video content, with video content using eye tracking glasses. So I'm very excited about that, because eye tracking glasses allow us to really take people into the wild, right? Or walk with them, take them to a store and measure what they look at and what attracts their attention. It's also very messy because there's so much around us and we cannot control everything. I'm also developing a study that would measure attention to this website's dark patterns. So what I'm interested in is all these choice architectures of websites, or the elements that kind of nudge us or trigger certain choices, which are not always good for us as consumers, right? So think about all the accept the cookie requests, right? Most of the time they are with green button, accept all, right? So that would be an example of a dark pattern. And another study that my lab is working on is emotional responses to humans versus AI agents. And here we're using facial recognition. And facial recognition, this is a picture from Microsoft. We're using emotions, but the whole idea again is very old, right? And previously the idea is that we have basic emotions that we all kind of express in the same way on our faces. And in the older days, we would just manually code them. But now we have algorithms and companies that promise us algorithms that they can identify them automatically. And this is happening. It does have practical implications. So this is an example that just, made me, at first I thought, oh, it's interesting, but then I was like, oh, this is such a privacy violation. But this is an example of a crashed advertisement, which revealed the code of facial recognition system. And you can see how they try to analyze attention and gender and age, and actually there's software that looks at so whether people are happy or sad, right? And the idea here is that we have these micro expressions, right? I mean, I'm very expressive, so they are not micro. But even if we don't want to express certain emotions, we still have micro expressions. So these tiny movements of our facial muscles that are assumed to communicate our inner state. So whether we're happy or sad or frustrated. And when people look at them, when another human looks at my micro expressions, they may not be able to identify them at all, or maybe they will misinterpret them. They're very tiny, very quick, and often unconscious. So the idea is that these algorithms can actually identify these micro expressions. But there's lots of discussion about emotions and whether we can do that. If you dive into that literature, it's actually fascinating because researchers disagree. And I think we often learn a lot from the literature where researchers kind of debate certain issues. So first of all, these algorithms are often trained on pictures that are posed, right? So if you ask me, make a happy face, I mean, am I really happy then, right? So how good am I at pretending that I'm happy or angry? The effects in lab studies are subtle. So we'll see. We haven't tested that yet. It seems that there are cultural and behavioral differences between people when it comes to how they express their emotions, as well as like language and context and cultural individual differences, and even in how we experience emotions, right? So happiness may be experienced very differently and mean very different thing, a different thing for each of us. And also, like, we may be different when we are in a social context versus in private. So does my smile when I sit in front of my computer and do something and someone sends me a nice email, or like, I don't know, I see a nice cat video and then I smile, is that smile the same as the one that I, present to people when I'm with others, right? And there is research that tries to tap into that, and we see that some expressions are more difficult to identify. So they ask people to to say what this face, for example, expresses, and whether it's anger or disgust or fear or happiness or surprise. And some of these emotions, they seem similar to us, so they may be difficult. Okay, and this is the final slide. So I ran through them, but I wanted to be on time. And there are other issues to watch out for. So while I love biometrics, we also have to watch out for like how they perform across different groups, right? Different demographics, because they were always trained on someone. Is there any bias? Are there any biases in those algorithms? And often we don't know until we try, right? So it's good to try on different people. Like, for example, especially in eye tracking studies, we used to exclude people who were who had impaired vision, right? Or like we only accepted people who wore contacts, but not people who used to wear glasses. Now it's less of an issue for modern eye trackers and we can include them, but before we weren't able to do that. Would that affect our measurement? Like, I don't know. We need like these validity tests, right? During COVID, we found out that these devices that measure the oxygen in blood, right? Or like, yeah, so oximeters, that they don't work on everyone equally, right? And it was, again, we found that out by by chance, right? Just by using it on many, many different people from representing different populations. So this is just something to be very careful about. Yeah, and just try to consider that as you develop your studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Oh my goodness, that was so much great information. We do have a few questions, if you wouldn't mind seeing if you can field a couple of these. Zandria asked, could advertisers or social media platforms use this unethically in order to keep us on their platforms or buy their products? Do you think there's going to be restrictions at any time?
Yes, so I don't have this. Oh, it's such a pity. Like, I don't have that slide with me, that example. But so before I moved to the US, I lived in the Netherlands, right? And before GDPR, which is the privacy regulation, there was a huge scandal because there was a company that put these electronic billboards on train stations. And those billboards had ads for different, back then it was different movies, and they had cameras. And the cameras recorded facial expressions, right, to measure people's reactions to those. Some journalists found out it wouldn't be possible today because of GDPR, but there are, of course, many countries around the world that don't have privacy regulations. And you can imagine companies using facial expressions to target us with different products. I know that Walgreens has these smart fridges. They're not very popular though, but they had these smart fridges with cameras as well, that would, record our faces. So you can Google that. You can look for like some articles about that. And overall, I think that goes beyond facial expression analysis, but there's a lot of targeting on emotions happening in advertising, right? So if you think about Spotify, like what kind of songs I listen to, like they try to figure out, am I happy? Am I sad? What am I angry? Am I exercising? What's going on, right? The New York Times and probably other outlets like is the article that I'm reading making me happy? What should they or sad? What should they target me with? So that's already happening. I know that Netflix also like analyze not our emotions, but kind of like, how they have this tiny, oh my gosh, how do you call those? Tiny squares in which they show you like like the movie, and there's some people in it. So they would analyze those scenes and the emotions of the people in those scenes to figure out which emotions attract more clicks. So when you're more likely to watch a movie, right? What kind of emotions should be visible? And so there are things going on in that area.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I'm curious if, of course, nobody knows for sure, but what the regulations might eventually, if the regulations will ever catch up with the technology, it seems like the technology
Yeah,
is further ahead than any regulations. Um,
that's true.
yeah. So, Imran, did you want to ask your question? You have one in here. Oh, you're muted. There we
Okay,
go.
so my question was that how advertising students like be trained in biometric research and what kind of benefit they could get out of it?
Yeah, I think like the implications of like biometrics for advertising overall, like are very like interesting and beneficial, and that we can really figure out what attracts people's attention and how it makes them feel, right? And I think especially for students, it's useful to learn not only about the tools themselves, but kind of what they really measure. So what does it mean that someone pays attention? Or like, especially in the industry, they talk a lot about engagement with something, right? Engagement with social media, with ads. But what does it really mean? How does it translate into our attention, our cognitive processing? Is it always, quite often, especially in the industry, they say, oh, higher engagement, better outcomes, right? And that's often the case, but it doesn't have to be, right? If you truly understand the process behind engagement, then you may be like, not necessarily. Um, so I think there are like lots of benefits in learning, of course, about the metrics and the measures, but also about the processes that biometrics are trying to tap into. I think that's the main, because then it doesn't matter what kind of method you use when you go and work in the industry, for example, because you understand what you're measuring and what the, pros and cons are.
So I have one more question. Like, do you offer like courses specific to biometric research, or like you integrate biometrics in research courses as one of the topic?
For us, it's one of the topics. Yeah, so we don't have that. I know in like, the psych department, they would do that. For us, it's more integrated into like research courses. And then if students are interested, then they join the lab and they come up with a project and we help them out and we guide them.
Thank
But yeah,
you.
we don't have a separate course on that.
Yeah.
Maybe in the future.
Thanks.
We have a couple more questions in the chat, and also I see Anthony, you've got your hand up. I think I'll just go in order if that's all right. Georgia, your question was next in the chat. Would you like to pose that question?
Sure, yeah. So, obviously people have a lot of mixed feelings with AI as a tool or a helper. And I was just wondering, like, are people worried about using AI as a tool in this context? Because it seems more like it's not AI in the scary way, it's just like looking at people's faces. But like, is there a concern there? Like,
So I think, so let me start by, I think many people don't realize what's possible and what companies can measure with the data that we give them, being that also our faces, right? So I don't think many people know that all the pictures that we contribute to the online world can be used to train these algorithms, but also to like identify our emotions, right? I think when they do learn about it, I think they are concerned, but there's also very little we can do. So depending on the state, right, the regulations, as Robin mentioned, they're not there. Like we're behind, right? The technology is developing much faster than our regulations. So some states do have biometrics laws, like how we can opt out, and still it's always on the consumer. So it's not the company that has to get my approval. I have to make an effort to opt out and make them delete my data, right? So many people then just won't do it.
Sierra, do you want to pose your question?
Hi. So I think my question actually even kind of follows George's just a little bit, but I was just wondering why or how is biometrics not considered an invasion of privacy? Because it can be invasive and like intruding. So I'm just kind of seeing how we're able to get around that because I I feel like it's in so many of our phones as is, the apps we use, just so many different things we do. How are we getting around that? Is it's not a crime?
Yeah, it's in terms of conditions. I mean, like this is what which no one reads because it's impossible because they have 100 pages and are written in like legal language that is impossible for most of us to understand even. I agree that it should be, right? It should be. It's different when you go to the lab or you participate in a panel and you're like, fine, you track my, I know, skin conductance, right? I will watch some whatever, some TV, and I get something out of it. But at least I know what you're collecting. I agree to that. It's clear. But then let's say you have a smartwatch, right? And then you agree to terms and conditions, and then we don't know. And then it depends because like at least within the EU, it's not perfect, but at least the regulation does talk a little bit about that we have to understand and we need to, agree. Again, people usually don't read, so they will agree anyway, right? But I like, let's say my watch tracks my heart rate and temperature and, and like my activities and my location. So biometrics together with all the other data points can give a company like very rich data set, a very rich data set that they can use to then understand me better, my behaviors, my preferences, right, my emotions, when they should like contact me, for example, when they should send me an ad. And I agree that it is an invasion of like our privacy, especially if we don't realize what's going on and we don't agree, right? But again, it's probably in the terms and conditions.
Okay, we'll take one more, and that would be Anthony.
Thank you. Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Anthony. I'm a faculty member here. And I was really interested when you were talking about combining biometrics data with some qualitative data, and I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about how you did that.
Which
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, was that like in a particular context or like overall?
Just in general, like how students, whether they're working on like a project or a thesis or something, how they might like, or faculty members or whoever, how they might like even conceptualize how to put this together.
Yeah, so quite often we just assume that, oh, we will, do the biometric study in the lab and maybe have some survey next to it, right? And that's pretty standard.
Okay, so the survey is what you collect as data, not the movements. Is that right? That's what I was trying to figure out. So like, 'cause I don't do biometrics research. So like do you have people fill out a survey with the biometrics and that's what your data become?
Yeah, so usually we would record the biometrics. So like, for example, eye tracking or skin conductance, then give them a survey as well. Sometimes we can also like content analyze, or when we develop the stimulus, it depends, right? If you develop and control the stimulus, or if you like use something like, for example, in that other study, they use the actual Facebook feed or like the social media, then you code that content more qualitatively and correlate with, the physiological responses.
Okay, that makes more sense. I'm sorry. Since I don't do this kind of research, I thought you were like pulling biometrics like prick points. And that's what you were using for your quantitative data. But you're saying the quantitative data usually come from like the surveys that people fill out. Is that right?
And
okay, now I get it.
And like you get also like lots of the part that may have been like confusing is like how we use the heat maps, for example, right? Because those are not very like quantitative. So if you like, we get like lots of quantitative metrics for like areas of interest. So we can look at like where the eyes were, like coordinates actually, if we want to, right? Or like how long the eyes fixated on a certain area. Or did people come back to that area? Like all these different things. But we can also like have these heat maps, which are averaged across all the participants. I mean, you can average that for one participant as well, but usually we use them to compare just, oh, it looks like that person was like, the attention was more intensive in a specific area, right? But we have to always like check that against actual metrics that we get.
Okay, no, that makes more sense. Thank you for allowing that question. I appreciate it.
Well, I think we got through all our questions. We had a fantastic afternoon of lots of information on biometrics.
I'm sorry.
No. You were fantastic, and I think a lot of people learned a lot of things today. So we appreciate having you, and we invite. Yeah, thank you.
And then if anyone has like follow-up questions, here's my email. I think it's still, I will stop sharing now, but if there's anything that comes up, later, or anyone has any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ewa. We really appreciate that. And just to all the participants, we thank you for joining us for our first Techfluence Talks from the Advertising Public Relations Biometrics Lab. We're planning on having a talk per semester, I believe. So, Imran, if you'd like to add to that at all.
We are also we're planning to bring more speakers so that our students understand the value of using biometrics and what are the fascinating area of research. It can tell us a lot about how we behave, and most of the time we can test it out, which one is working and which one is not. So it's like kind of like really good. I feel like for me, it's a good adventure to actually have using those methods.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're fortunate to have this lab and also to have experts like Ewa come join us and talk more about it. So everybody pay attention to when we decide to have another tech talk. It'll probably be next semester. And yeah, have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for
Thank you,
coming.
Ewa.
Bye now.
Bye.